Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. With the end of the original sanctions now in play, Washington's neocons and allies are down, but certainly not on the run. What is their greatest fear? That peace and prosperity will break out? In the meantime, what will be the impact on Iran, the country that is the clear winner in all of this? To Crosstalk Iran, I'm joined by my guest, Leverett in Washington. She is currently the CEO of Stratega, a political risk consultancy, and co-author of the book Going to Tehran. In Cambridge, we have Ghoncheh Tazmini. She is an associate member at the Center for Iranian Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And in Berlin, we cross to Ali Fathollah-Nejad. He is a political scientist with the German Council on Foreign Relations. Right, Crosstalk rules, in effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Hillary, if I go to you first here, Patrick Coburn wrote on the 17th of this month for The Independent. Title of his article, Iran nuclear deal leaves Tehran looking stronger as so many of its neighbors fall apart. Subtitle, Analysis, Iran has escaped years of isolation and the threat of war without sustaining much damage. In his view, Iran is the clear winner in all this. What is your take? Go ahead.
I think Iran is the clear winner. They have been a rising power in the Middle East. For many, many years. They have an indigenously created, hard-fought political system that they made themselves. It wasn't imposed on them by the West or anybody else. So warts and all, they have their own system which they continue to build up and strengthen, and they do so in a way that makes them stronger in defiance of other attempts to impose, other countries' wills on them. And they've done it, through war, through the Iraqi invasion of Iran, through U.S. sanctions, unrelenting U.S. sanctions. So they are an incredibly important rising power, and the rest of the region has in a lot of ways sold out to the West, especially to the United States. Those governments don't represent those populations, and they're showing weakness because of that.
Ghoncheh, what's your take in Cambridge here? Because, a lot of people around the world look at the additional sanctions because of the ballistic missile test as kind of an insult to injury, is that the United States actually is not being fair and open and transparent about its intentions. I mean, within 24 hours, new sanctions being imposed. I mean, that breaks the spirit of the agreement, at least in my mind, in the mind of a lot of other people as well. Go ahead, in Cambridge.
Yes, certainly it questions U.S. goodwill on establishing this tentative rapprochement with Iran, especially after it comes one day after the implementation day, the removal of international sanctions on Iran. So it does cast doubt. In particular, I think that it is something that Iran has condemned, and it will embolden hardline stance in Iran and make it more difficult for President Rouhani to sell this nuclear deal and to also consolidate his political platform, which is part and parcel of which is reaching out to the West.
Ali, one of the interesting things is that we find, if looking at the entire conflict between the West and Iran, particularly with the United States here, is that it's the hardliners that are always doing the other hardliners a really big favor. In Washington, they're looking at how dare they touch our boats in their territorial waters, and then you have the hardliners in Tehran saying, see, the Americans, you can't trust them there. It's interesting how they work together.
I mean, undoubtedly so. During the so-called nuclear crisis over the past decade, there has been a play that was, a game that was played between both sides' hardliners in actually extending the duration of the conflict. And I think although things have calmed down and moderate forces from both sides have taken the upper hand, we cannot be, ignorant of the prowess of some fundamentalists or some hardline areas on both sides. So this is still, something to reckon with in terms of disturbing this process of rapprochement.
Yeah, Hillary, Gareth Porter has been often on this program here, and I really look to him as a guiding light of of sanity. And he wrote a fascinating article a couple days ago, and everyone, a lot of people look how Iran's going to change its behavior. I hate when they use that word behavior in the region as a result of this deal. But one of the things he points out, and I think it's really interesting, is that it's really how the U.S. has an opportunity, I stress, to change its behavior, because it is creating some leverage with, well, the prima donnas in the region, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. It's Washington's favorite allies here. I think he's right. It's how the U.S. reacts to this deal. And unfortunately, we're in an election cycle in the U.S. Go ahead.
It's even the U.S. approach to getting this deal. I mean, we have to keep in mind that Iran's policy, the outreach to the United States, or the decision to engage the United States on the nuclear issue, was not taken by President Rouhani. It was taken beforehand during the presidency of Ahmadinejad under the same supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. The difference was here. The shift was here in Washington. And the shift here, to give President Obama credit, was that he looked out at the Middle East and saw U.S. policy there in free fall.
Yep.
We had fires from Libya to Pakistan. Every single country that the United States had touched had burned up in his face. To his credit, he thought he could do essentially a kind of Nixon to China approach, give the United States more strategic options by engaging Iran with strategically grounded diplomacy. And that has paid off. The Middle East is not going to become peace and peace and tranquility overnight, if ever. But for the United States, we now have more options in the region because of this strategically grounded diplomacy. The challenge for Obama is to continue in his last year in office to do this with Russia over Syria on a range of other issues in the Middle East and globally before the next group comes in, because there's not really a strategic visionary among them, not just on the Republican side, but even on the so-called progressive side. Their foreign policy perspectives are not that different from the Republicans running.
In the meantime, Ghoncheh, if I go to you in Cambridge, in the meantime, during this last year of the Obama administration, and I've been a very strong critic of this president in foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East, but I give him credit for this, a lot of credit, actually. But I look at like a country like Saudi Arabia that has been a real, it's been very, very aggressive on all fronts, even domestically over the last year or so. They're playing the role of a spoiler, and their approach here is to make the U.S. decide one way or another. You're with Saudi Arabia and Riyadh, or you're against it. How is that going to play out in your mind? Go ahead.
Well, I think that there's this ongoing Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and both are vying for influence in the region. And I do think that the Saudis will do anything they can to thwart any process whereby Iran comes out from the cold. In terms of entering the international community, of playing a more substantive role in international organizations and in regional conflicts, I think the Saudi Arabia sees that as a great threat. Again, there is a lot of hypocrisy in the region with the U.S. Just a couple days ago, or a few days ago, the Iranians condemned these new sanctions on Iran's anti-ballistic missile program by saying that the U.S. has no moral or legal legitimacy in pursuing such an act, especially since it sells weaponry to its regional allies, who are responsible for many of the killings in Yemen, for instance. So there's all this hypocrisy, and there are mixed messages. But on the other hand, I think we should give Obama credit in the sense that, very similar to rapprochement with Cuba, Obama is selling the nuclear deal as a success in international diplomacy, and the nuclear deal will be a big part of his legacy, an important part of his legacy.
Hillary, you want to jump in real quick there?
Peter,
Go ahead.
if I may, because I think it's fundamentally different than the shift with Cuba, because the shift with Cuba, the Obama shift with Cuba, we didn't have to give up anything else in Latin America. There were no other countries that were against that. In fact, all of Latin America, the entire world, was in favor of the United States changing its ridiculous policy toward Cuba. But with Iran, it's completely different. With Iran, there is a fundamental challenge to the U.S.-Saudi relationship, which is decades old and extremely dysfunctional. It's thoroughly corrupt, and it's something that poisons the U.S. approach to the Middle East and even the global economic order. That is going to be an incredibly difficult challenge for President Obama to tackle in his last year, and we've actually seen very little sign that he's willing to do so. But that's the challenge for the United States.
Another interesting challenge, if I'm going to Ali in Berlin, which one of the things that, if you look at the rhetoric coming out of Western capitals, particularly the think tanks in Washington, D.C., is that Iran, they're hysterical people, they're irrational people, they're crazy people. It goes on and on and on. But you know what? You can sign an agreement with them. Oh, some American sailors got caught in your territorial waters. Oh, you apologize? No problem. We'll feed them. We'll send them back to Bahrain, where they've been, those people have had their rights suppressed by Saudi Arabia with the permission of the United States here. All of a sudden, the people in Tehran you can talk to. I think that's going to be one of the most important things that will filter down through time, is that, well, actually, they do sign, they have pens and they can sign pieces of paper. That's what the neocons don't want the rest of the world, particularly the American public, to know. Go ahead.
I mean, this process of normalization is certainly a good thing, because it opens various diplomatic channels that are indispensable to find political solutions in the entire West Asian region, in so many theaters of conflict. But I think what is interesting when you look at the Iran analyses over the last 2 years since Rouhani, assumed the presidency, we see a clear shift, because beforehand there was this neocon-dominated discourse on Iran that was quite, demonizing Iran, and that was not reflecting the, reality in the Islamic Republic. On the other hand, you see a new tendency of giving a very, positive picture of Iran that is, again, also somehow misleading, because Iran has also a lot of, problems, challenges internally in terms of the deep socioeconomic problems. There are some aspects of Iranian foreign policy that are quite problematic. If you look at its Syria and its Iraq policy. So I think as neutral observers, we should be not doing any of that. So we should try to find a complex but honest picture of the situation.
I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Iran. Stay with RT.
People with stories to tell. Those who deserve to be heard. Studied inside out, but still with unrevealed secrets. Leaders, politicians, thinkers, and witnesses. They're here to speak. Are you there to hear?
Here's what people have been saying about Redacted tonight. Give it to us. Redacted is full-on awesome. The only show I go out of my way to watch every week. It really packs a punch. Lee Camp is the John Oliver of RT America. You guys do have the same accent. Hey, we are apparently better than boobs.
Nothing's better than boobs.
You see, people you've never heard of love Redacted tonight. The president of the World Bank, though, hates it.
He doesn't really have any taste.
Seriously, he sent us an email.
5 seconds. And over the mic is all fueling to go.
Did you know the press is the only industry specifically mentioned in the Constitution?
Stand by.
That's because a free and open press is critical to our democracy.
Track Alpha. Roll Alpha.
In fact, the single biggest threat facing our nation today is the corporate takeover of our government and our press.
Stand by, camera 1.
We've been hijacked by a handful of powerful transnational corporations that will profit by destroying what our founding fathers once built up. I'm Tom Hartman, and on this show, we reveal the big picture of what's actually going on in the world. We go beyond identifying the problem.
We try to fix it.
Rational debate and a real discussion of the critical issues facing America.
Stand by on camera. Go.
Ready to join the movement? Then welcome to the big picture.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the world after the big deal. Okay, Hillary, I'd like to go back to you in Washington. A sad fact, a sad reality is that there's so many forces, institutionalized forces, particularly in Washington, D.C., that have made a career, a generational career, off the demonization of Iran, making sure Iran remains an enemy, and making sure, more than anything else, in my mind, that there's never any peace, there's never any instability. This is what, creates careers. Let's be honest about it. And they generate a lot of money from Gulf countries to keep on, the struggle against the great demon in Tehran, or whatever you want to call it. And this is something that it has to be reckoned with, because they do influence policy in a very important way, and they get the ear of politicians, and most politicians don't have an idea what they're talking about when it comes to most foreign policy issues, at least in my opinion. Go ahead, Hillary.
I completely concur with that point, and I see it, and I'm involved in it here firsthand in Washington, D.C. All of the think tanks here have basically privately funded centers by those with very significant agendas of their own, whether they're in favor of Saudi Arabia, other Gulf states, or Israel. They have their own agendas, and they privately fund these centers in each of the think tanks, and then they give overall funding to the think tanks. You have that also happening at universities. Universities more and more have their centers for Middle East studies, which are privately funded by billionaires with clear agendas. Then the U.S. government also adds their funding, which is, supposedly this kind of counterterrorism funding, but really is about demonization of particularly countries like Iran. And it's not Iran per se because of something in its, civilization going back thousands of years. It's really about Iran as an independent power center in the region. We saw this in the 1990s about Iraq, when there was the possibility that Iraq could be an independent power center. And we even saw that back in the 50s and 60s with Nasser's Egypt. This is a structural problem in the United States. But today, with the enormous income disparity and these billionaires that control so much of the agenda, it has thoroughly corrupted the think tanks and academia here. And, personally, I was forced out of my university, and that's why I've started a political risk consultancy, because the university didn't like my book where I had traveled to Iran and interviewed actually Iranians in Iran. That was considered, beyond the pale, because those people, of course, couldn't possibly be free to express their opinions. So it's, the discourse here is thoroughly corrupted and agenda-driven.
Ghoncheh, if I can go to you in Cambridge, how do we, square the circle there? Because there is so much pressure. Go ahead. You want to add to that? Please go ahead.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Hillary. There's definitely a bias when it comes to Iran experts or Middle East experts who are more critical of Iran and more favorable towards the Arab states. So you see that in funding of programs, of projects, and it's quite clear at every level. I think that what's really lacking is objective scholarly analysis on Iran, and I mean, SOAS is doing a particularly great job with that. But you have the proliferation of Iran experts everywhere. In every corner of the world, you have a think tank, and you know, who sponsors these think tanks is the issue. Are these impartial, unbiased entities that simply want to fund good, well-researched, balanced, objective scholarship, and that's what's truly lacking. And I'm sure any research fellow or professor has felt that.
You know, Ali, one of the things that has happened to me on this program many, many times is that I will ask a question like, well, let's talk about the Saudi-Israeli relationship in dealing with Syria and all that. And the number of people that kind of turn their head away or want to change the subject or just say something completely different, say, well, I'd like to go back to a different point, actually. You know, when some people just feel so uncomfortable and addressing those kinds of issues here, when it is a reality, there is a relationship there, both countries talk about it, but, you know, academics and some people in the media just don't want to go there because they're afraid. I mean, that's timidity in the public sphere here, and I think that's one of the problems in coming to a resolution with Iran. And to address the point that you made right before the break here, every country has its own national interest and will define it differently. You don't have to like it, and I don't know why Iran should be treated differently. Go ahead.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, the treatment Iran has faced since the revolution of 1979 has not been positive. It has been quite counterproductive. It has really been weakening Iranian society, Iranian civil society as well. So I've been one of amongst those people who have been advocating a political settlement in the nuclear crisis from the beginning. So I'm more than happy that this process has been successful so far. But the problem is that the debate is quite polarized. So, you know, for example, taking up the example that you talked about, if we talk about Syria, we can talk about the West's responsibility, the responsibility of Saudi Arabia and some other GCC countries. But to be fair, we have also to talk about the responsibility from the Assad regime, from the Iranian and Russian states supporting the Assad regime in this bloody conflict. So this, you know, independent observations, independent analyses requires some critical thinking towards all sides. Otherwise, we'll just continue with the polarized debates and will not be solving the issue, because if you look to the future...
You're absolutely right. And if I can go to Hillary in Washington, I mean, I'll take the example that you just gave, and I think that's a very good one here. But, you know, in Western media, and very few scholars like to admit it, is that under international law, sovereign states have a right to invite other countries to help defend their borders and society. And that's exactly what the Assad regime has done. And let me finish. In addressing the Russian Federation under international... I mean, what Putin did is he got all his ducks lined up, and he made it very clear under international law what Russia's policy is. Now, you can disagree with it, it's fine, but it's legal under international law. Again, when dealing with Iran, the relationship between the Assad regime and Iran is well known, okay? And there's nothing illegal about it. You may not like it, but, you know, the relationship that Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries and Turkey and Israel in its relationship or involvement in the Syrian civil war is against international law. So my point is, if you take the same point of reference, then you can actually talk about it in a sensible way. And not just saying, well, Iran is, you know, look what Iran is doing in Tehran. I mean, in Syria. It doesn't make any sense. It's just a prejudiced comment. Hillary, go ahead.
But
well,
Peter,
and,
we're
you know,
talking
the
about
debate,
the conflict,
it's
so we're talking about the politics, not necessarily of international law.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Hillary.
Yeah, but I mean... But the debate is it's not just that it's polarized, it's really corrupted, so that anybody who has any data or has any experience, any knowledge of being on the ground in Syria, dealing with President Bashar al-Assad. You know, my husband and I interviewed him many times for a book that my husband ended up writing while I was still in the U.S. government. It's a much different picture if you actually have dealt with Assad, you understand what's going on there, if you've dealt with Iranian officials, if you've dealt with Russian officials, not in a way of trying to judge them, but to try to understand their interests and their policies. But then when you try to bring that experience, that data, that information into the U.S. debate, it's completely shut down as some sort of apologetics, and then replaced by these well-financed, agenda-driven, know-nothing approaches coming particularly from the Saudis and the Israelis, who don't go to Iran, who don't go to Syria, who don't take those officials seriously, and then but their views are bought, paid for, and put on mainstream media here in the United States incessantly. And then those people are also brought in as advisors to presidential campaigns, to senatorial campaigns, and they completely dominate the political process here. So now here we are, more than 4 years after the war in Syria started, at least 200,000 lives lost. And do you know what's happened to U.S. policy? We've finally realized reality. You know, Secretary of State Kerry finally is having thorough conversations with Foreign Minister Lavrov and Foreign Minister Zarif. And what's happened? With that knowledge, U.S. policy has changed. U.S. policy is no longer this ridiculous idea, Assad has to go. No, we have to deal with the government there, allow it to consolidate its authority, and get serious about ISIS. That's what happens when you have a reality-based approach that allows people like Foreign Minister Lavrov and Foreign Minister Zarif to be in the debate.
Go ahead in Cambridge, jump in, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the problem is, I mean, it's a case of the teapot calling the kettle black. If you look at the Syrian case in isolation, as Hillary says, yes, there's shift in view in terms of whether Assad stays or goes. But the fact is that you have to look at this in the context of all of the U.S. military adventures in the region and all of its efforts to establish some hegemonic rule or to intervene using the right to protect clause in different occasions, and you see the fallout, and you see all of the conflicts that have emerged because of that approach, the neocon hawkish approach. So it's very hard to sell the U.S. as a champion of human rights in the region.
Exactly.
That is part of the problem.
Exactly. If I go back to Ali here, I'm glad you brought up Syria here. Do you think now, in the environment that we have in this post-deal environment, that that Iran will have a better seat at the table to help end the resolve this civil war in Syria, because it is a key player. It cannot be ignored. This agreement it gives them legitimacy. Can that legitimacy be transferred to being treated as a serious player to end the civil war in Syria? We got about 1 minute. Go ahead.
I mean, the renewed tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, there's a dark shadow coming from that on a political resolution of the conflict in Syria. So things are going to be more complicated. But there is no question that Iran is an integral part of the solution, since it is an integral player in Syria. So, of course, Iran has to be a part of the solution. But things are going to be more complicated because of those renewed tensions, unfortunately.
Okay, 20 seconds, Hillary, go ahead.
But with all due respect to my colleague in Berlin, this, of course, sentiment is rather new. Just a year ago, the United States was refusing to work with Russia, refusing to work with Iran, regardless of reality. It took Secretary Kerry to fundamentally turn around, change U.S. policy, and listen to important players on the international stage, like Russia, like Iran.
Okay, Hillary, on that note, we have run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Washington, Cambridge, and in Berlin. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.
I love you.